Hey, this is the Kundalini Collective podcast number 15. And today we're very happy to have a member of the collective, Nigel Robinson. And Nigel is an active member of our collective. He's been going through the process for a couple of years. Nigel used to live a corporate life, family man, lived in London, and like many of us, had a spontaneous awakening out of the blue without any spiritual background, which is why it's going to be quite an interesting conversation with Nigel. And often we like to have people who are not experts in the Kundalini awakening, but they are members of our collective, just ordinary people who've gone through the process, and they've always got something interesting to give to the conversation. So today, thanks, Nigel, for joining us, and tell us a bit about your experience, anything you want to talk about, your journey, your background, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, Samir. Hi, Alan. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I was a little bit nervous when I agreed to do this, but I'm super happy to be here, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to tell my story. It does feel like, I guess, an important moment for me in a way to be able to tell my story, because I think for a time that was part of the issue, was feeling a bit isolated. So it's great to have people to talk to, and feels like a privilege and an honor to be able to share my story with you and everyone else who's going to listen to it. So thanks a million. I think the context is, as you said, was one of no context. So kind of bloke in his 50s, living in Southwest London, in a very commercial career job, and no background in spirituality. I mean, arguably the opposite, sort of quite an egotistical, materialistic kind of person who's generally been quite competitive and achievement orientated, good at sports and all that kind of thing. So I was potentially one of the last people you would point to as spiritual in any way. So when this happened, it really did come out of the blue for me, and was a big surprise, and took quite a long time for me to work out what was going on. But yeah, if you like, I could just talk about, kind of the day it happened. So I had been doing quite a bit of breathwork meditation, and I'd just been doing it like a lot of people to, just get control of stress, and in a busy life, and there's lots of information nowadays, isn't there, about mindfulness and meditation, and these are good things to do to help us all, sleep better. And I was quite into that, I guess, self-development. How do we be happy? Eat well, sleep well, don't be stressed. And there's lots of that kind of information around, isn't there? And I was listening to podcasts about those sort of things, and exercise, and be in shape. And if you do all these things, you'll lead a happy and fulfilled life. So I think I was just trying to be that person, and meditating became part of it, and got into this breathwork meditation. I've been doing it for about 2 or 3 months. Not super heavy. Well, I used to do, a meditation for maybe 50 minutes on the weekends, but in the week it was just 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day. And I read this really interesting book called Breathe In, Breathe Out. Can't remember the name of the author, but it was all about the breath, and the benefit of, nasal breathing and having control of your breath. I was watching Wim Hof videos and things like that. So very much, just as a sort of amateur. And in the book, it recommended a 30-day emotional release. So I thought, well, why don't I do that? So I did this 30-day emotional release, and it was literally 10 minutes every day that I did in the morning, of a circular breath, breathing in for was it 3 or 6 seconds, and then breathing out for the same amount, and just doing this circular breath in and out, in and out, in and out. But just for 10 minutes, that's all it was. But on the last day of the 30 days, quite often when I meditated, I would think about positive things, think about people I loved, or think about, sort of happy thoughts, if you like, was where I would try to be. And I remembered on this day just thinking to myself, just see what comes up. Just don't think anything, just see what comes up. And at the end of this 10 minutes, or near the end of this 10 minutes, I suddenly had a thought about my mum. And I'd have a difficult relationship with my mum. I had a really happy childhood. I was really fortunate, good parents, stable family. But there was something going on with my mum. She had her sort of challenges, was quite anxious, and I responded to that in a particular way. I was quite avoidant as a kid. Um, and I think it's fair to say I sort of resented my mum, you know what I mean? I kind of related to my dad and not my mum. And anyway, in this meditation, it suddenly hit me just how much I'd resented my mum. She died a year earlier. And it suddenly hit me like it was like a bus hit me, that actually I'd never really truly fully properly felt close and loved my mum. And suddenly it hit me that I'd actually spent my whole life feeling unloved. And this idea that I'd not felt loved completely, just seemed like incredibly important and massive. And it seemed suddenly that I'd spent my whole life with this sort of emotional blockage, that there'd been something in the way, there'd been something missing, that there'd been this fundamental feeling that I wasn't loved and I hadn't been loved. And it had got in the way of all my relationships, and it'd been like an emotional blockage on me. And I suddenly felt kind of brokenhearted. I suddenly felt that I'd missed out on this fundamental and important thing, which was to feel loved. And I was a man in my 50s, and I'd sort of been missing out on this all my life. And I felt very abandoned and brokenhearted, and I just sort of broke down, crying and sobbing in a kind of grief, loneliness, like I'd been cast aside somehow. Which all sounds very extreme, but this is how I felt. I really felt, I think, brokenhearted is the best way to put it. And then suddenly I got this image of my mum, and I don't mean a strange image. I just mean I saw my mum in the picture of my mind, and I suddenly realized that she'd always been there for me, that she'd always loved me. She'd always been in my corner. She'd always backed me up. She'd always wanted the best for me, fed me, clothed me, done everything that I could, have wanted a mum to do. And I suddenly bounced from this feeling abandoned and brokenhearted into feeling completely loved. And suddenly my heart just like burst open. It was just, it's hard to describe, but it was like a physical, emotional feeling of this heart bursting open. And I suddenly felt engulfed by love, triggered by this, quintessential, your mother has always loved you, even though you didn't feel it. And that just, that just created what I would, what is this sort of massive heart opening. And then suddenly I realized I'd always been loved. I will always be loved. I am love. I will never be anything but loved. And like all these thoughts came flushing through my mind really quickly, that all the validation that I'd been seeking externally in life, trying to succeed, trying to win, wanting to be the best, was all a compensation for the idea that I wasn't actually loved. And that was false, and it wasn't true. And that I didn't need to do that anymore. I didn't need to seek any of this external validation, because I am love and I'll always be loved, and that will never change. And so all these thoughts came rushing in about just almost being the essence of love, and me not needing to do all the things that I've been struggling to do all life. So it was like this massive sort of penny dropping moment where I kind of literally saw the light of truly who I am. And then I just suddenly felt my job is to stop seeking to be loved. My job is to love. My role here is to love everything I see, and love everything that I experience, and love everybody that I'm with. That is the key to happiness. It's the opposite of what you've been trying to do. You've been trying to be loved, and you've been doing it completely the wrong way around. And it's suddenly like, oh my God, I've just understood everything I've done wrong in the whole of my life, and what the answer is. And it was a very, physical, emotional experience. And then that triggered, that then set off this bliss and euphoria. which prevailed for quite a long time. I don't know exactly how long, but I can remember walking the dog down the street and bursting into tears because I felt so happy and I didn't know why. I was just full of bliss and joy and happiness, but there was no reason for it. There was no context for it other than this experience that I'd had. And yeah, there was a realization, but I was kind of walking around in this state of bliss and joy, thinking, well, how long is this going to go on for? Is this it? Like, is that it? Like, this is not going to stop. Is this the rest of my life, or is this going to go away? And that's the sort of state that I was in for a little while, and just a bit, obviously enjoying it. I'm like, well, this is great, but equally, but what's going on? Like, how can this be? Like, surely this doesn't make any sense, you know? So that went on for a while. Then I was naturally, I sort of felt like I'd won the lottery. I thought, well, this thing has happened to me. It feels like I've sort of won the lottery. And this thought just came out over me, which is, well, who do I thank? And I literally just sort of looked up at the sky and held my hands out and thought, well, I need to thank God. You know, who else is there to thank? It just feels like I've sort of had this blessing somehow. And I just started to feel this very natural and huge gravity towards something bigger than me. And the only word I had for it was God. You know, was kind of, you know, this wasn't me. This isn't something I did. This was no choice that I made. This was no plan that I had. This just came out of the blue. And it felt very natural that there was something much bigger than me making it happen. And I should be very, very grateful for it. And that's exactly how I felt. So I almost just spontaneously started to pray, if you want to say it's pray, but it was more a gratitude and a thank you for everything that I had, which was this feeling of bliss and happiness and joy. So that started to happen. Yeah, and that went on for quite a while, actually. And of course, and I kept on doing the meditation. I didn't stop doing the meditation. I was doing the breath work. And then all the fireworks of the kriyas and the energy, you know, I became very conscious of this energy rushing up my body and into my head. You know, it was very sort of from the base of my spine and into my head, and just generally becoming electrified, and, you know, all this rushing of energy. In the context of all this bliss and euphoria that I was experiencing, it felt very natural, and it didn't feel like a problem, because it all felt like, well, this is just all part of this great feeling of bliss. So I was kind of welcoming it, to be honest. It wasn't like I didn't feel scared of it. It didn't feel unnatural. There was nothing scary about it at all. And in fact, I found it quite exciting. You know, I was meditating and getting all these energy rushes and thinking, wow, you know, what's going on with me? What is happening? But it feels great. You know, this feels good. This is not something, I don't want it to stop. You know, I didn't want it to stop. So great, but then quite confused as well. So, you know, how can this be? What's going on? I don't really understand it, but I'm not complaining. And then one day, literally one day, and I can remember sitting in my lounge, sitting on the sofa, and this thought just came to me, which was, what is Kundalini? And I think I'd heard the word before, but I didn't know what it was. And I didn't relate it to what I was doing. I just had this curiosity about Kundalini. I was like, what is Kundalini? What is that thing? I've heard people talk about it. So I Googled it. And of course, we all know the information that's available on the internet about Kundalini. So I quickly then got into the symptoms of Kundalini. And it didn't take me long to work out, oh, I think this is happening to me. This is describing my symptoms. This is the thing that seems to be happening to me. Um, and then I was struck with this in equal measure, I think, excitement, because, there's this promise of enlightenment, and like going, wow, wow, what spiritual enlightenment? Is that happening to me? But also in equal measure, there's lots of stories of the challenges, the difficulties, if you want to call the horror stories of Kundalini, right? Which it's not easy, and your life gets turned upside down. Dark night of the soul, etc., etc., etc. It's going to cleanse your body and purify your chakras, and it's not all a walk in the park. And certainly this idea that you will question everything in your life, that really resonated with me, because I was thinking, well, yeah, my whole psychology has changed. My whole outlook on the world has changed. I feel completely differently to what I did before. And it does feel like I'm going to reevaluate everything. And really, I wasn't ready for that change. I wasn't, well, I've got a family and I've got a family, kids, a job, a dog, a mortgage. I'm kind of thinking, I'm not ready to rip all of that up and start again. I just don't know how to even begin doing that. So I became quite scared of the prospect of all of this change that was potentially going to come along that I didn't feel in control of, because this whole experience it'd been so spontaneous that then, of course, you think, well, yeah, this thing is incredibly powerful. And if it's going to create this much change, how on earth am I going to cope with that? How am I going to navigate all of this? And so I suddenly felt like I'd been sort of pushed off the edge of a cliff, and I wasn't really in control of everything that was happening, which is kind of the case, isn't it? So yeah, excitement and fear in equal measure. And I think that was very quickly followed by loneliness, because then it suddenly struck me, wow, Kundalini is happening to me, and no one I know, basically, all my friends, all my family, my whole of my life is constructed around people who are not spiritual. And if I was to talk to them about the prospect of becoming enlightened, we'll probably think I've gone mad. So how do I even begin to talk to anyone about this? And I remember crying on my own, thinking, I can't do this alone. I don't want to do this alone. And I was just crying because I felt very, very, very alone. So incredibly mixed feelings, with, on the one hand, feeling this bliss, euphoria, and happiness, kind of excitement. And then in the next minute, this kind of fear and loneliness that really struck me super hard as well. So I just had no context for any of this. There was no guidelines. There was no context. I felt it was like it wasn't real. There was like the real life that was still going on. So I went to work and I had my job and I got my family and I'd sit down to dinner with them and we'd talk about, football or whatever, politics or family life. And then there was my inner world, and my inner world was raging with all of this other stuff that was going on. And they were not connected, and they were not in any way integrated. They were completely separate. And it's quite hard to hold that much inner world, because it's just you and it's all in your head, and there's no outlet for it. And so I was trying to go through my normal life, trying to hold all of this stuff. And really, as the days went by, it was getting harder and harder and harder to hold it. Really hard. And I didn't know where to start talking to anyone about it. I was like, I don't know where to begin. Yeah. So, I mean, my family noticed the difference. They could see I was going through something, doing something, and I think they were thinking, what is going on with you? I remember one of my kids saying to me one day, saying, yeah, Dad, I know what you're going to say. I said, what? That you love me? And I was like, yeah, well, I do love you. And it was like, suddenly I'd been turning around to my kids telling them I love them all the time. That's what I was full of, So I think they could see something was going on, but they didn't really know what was going on. I did pay close attention to all, the advice that was being handed out. So the brilliant thing about the internet and what was sort of saving me was people like Tara Springett, doing videos and podcasts talking about Kundalini and spontaneous awakenings, and and those sorts of Brent Spirit and other people. I didn't find yourselves at this point, so I hadn't found Kundalini Collective at this point. I needed you, but I hadn't found you yet. So there was lots of advice, and that was good. So they were saying, do this, don't do that, and don't worry, no one's going to die, and don't worry, it'll all be all right in the end. But it is going to be a lot of change, and there's a lot to navigate. I really did like Tara Springett because I'd liked her sort of practical approach. It's very sort of down to earth and straight talking, which I really liked. So I read those books and I took that advice. And one of the key things that really came through was you need a spiritual practice. You need to be spiritual to navigate this, and be part of it is a spiritual experience. So I thought, okay, that feels right to me. I feel that pull. I felt a massive pull and desire to go towards this spiritual thing, whatever it was, but this thing that was much bigger than me. But then the question was, well, how do I do that? Like how do I do spirituality? Where do I begin? Should I become a Buddhist? Should I become a Christian? Do I like what shape should this take for me? And then that became a challenge in itself because I approached that with my sort of left brain, my left brain achievement orientated thinking. Like, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it really well, and I want to do it right. So what's the right way for me to do spirituality? So I became a bit of a spiritual tourist, I think, visiting Buddhist centers and temples and yoga centers and just checking different things out. Thinking, well, I better just start looking around and see what fits. What resonates, what might work for me. So it was quite interesting with retrospect because I sort of looked into a lot of different areas of spirituality, sort of with some curiosity, trying to work out what would work for me. And I did land on something, which the esoteric Christianity resonated a lot with me. And so I started reading some books about that and got into that and came across a church, which, his website's a church called Awakening Together. And they have a 500-day course in the New Testament interpreted, which is kind of the person who set up the church sort of channeled a new version of the New Testament and wrote it and had created a 500-day teaching of it. I think I'm on day 464, so nearly through the 500 days. It's been great, actually, because it's just given me an anchor point and something to do daily. It's been a daily spiritual practice for me. And that's just what I needed, was just something to, get my teeth into, if you like, something that I could just put my arms around and say, okay, I'm going to do that. Because I was hopping around and bouncing around and should I do this and should I do that? And I needed to land somewhere. And actually the consistency of it's been really useful for me. And I'm really glad that I chose to do it. It might not be for everyone, but and when the 500 days is up, I'll do something else. But that proved to be a really good anchor point, actually. Yeah. And then as part of that journey, I stumbled upon the Kundalini Collective. I was really crying out to talk to some people who had had a Kundalini experience. So it's one thing listening to the likes of Tara Springett and watching their videos and reading their books. It's great to get that advice. But I really was yearning, it'd be great just to have a coffee with someone like who knows what on earth I'm talking about, and someone, just to have a chat with someone who can validate that I'm not going insane and this isn't all made up. And you know, I'm not just on some sort of trip. So when I stumbled on you guys, and you know, there's this prospect of a meetup in Hyde Park, and the Zoom calls, of course, as well, but particularly the meetup in Hyde Park, I was so looking forward to that. I can't tell you how much I was looking forward to it, just to meet some ordinary people and have a chat. And it was very satisfying to do that. It really was. So thank you for being there.
I guess you found out then it was a walk in the park. That's what we do on these meetups. We go for a walk around Hyde Park, go for a coffee.
Yeah, and it's just the down to earthness of it, which is, it's actually, that's the best thing about it, isn't it? Is you know, yeah, ordinary people talking about this extraordinary experience. Because naturally, when you know, when you see content on the internet and the books, you know, these tend to be from spiritual teachers and coaches and people who have got 30 years experience and are gurus or hang out with gurus. So whilst their advice is great and really welcome, yeah, that's just different to having a chat with someone you can really relate to. So yeah, it's taken me I think it's taken me best part of 2 years just to actually be comfortable with that. You know, there was this time of yeah, just me being so desperate to talk about it and not being able to talk about it. And I think now I'm at a point where I kind of don't need to talk about it. It's okay, you know, we're doing what we're doing and everyone's doing what they're doing, and we don't, or you know, it doesn't matter what you do. Yeah, you don't need it. You can share it with people when it's appropriate, and when it's not, and that's okay. So it's taken a while to get there, I think, just to settle into that place.
Do you want to talk a little bit about you mentioned what you mentioned before we started recording about the top down, bottom up aspect of your awakening? And just you've kind of diagnosed yourself. So how did you come to this conclusion? And could you explain to people what exactly is a top down versus a bottom up awakening?
Yeah, I do find it interesting, and not everyone's interested in it, which is fair enough. And I remember Tara Springett, you know, on some of her videos, emphasizing that we didn't need to get too obsessed about the plumbing, you know, the chakras, the process, where, you know, where is Kundalini, what's it doing, you know, how is that showing up in the body? Her advice was, look, it's just an expansion of consciousness. See it as an expansion of consciousness, and don't get too sidetracked by all this whole sort of science and conversation. Well, actually, I was quite interested in it. So, and if you, is it Joan Harrington?
Yeah.
And she's got that really great book about Kundalini science, which is the other end of the spectrum, right? So that's very detailed, all the different risings, you know, all the nadis, all the chakras, what's going on through the process, and the way the process can go through different risings, and you can have different experiences, and how that will show up in your experience. And so I got sort of quite into that science of it. Yeah, exactly what's happening. And I was relating that to my own experience. And predominantly the experience that I was having was a feeling that there was a lot of energy getting stored up in my sort of base chakra. And then it would zoom up my spine, and it would feel like my head was going to sort of expanding, you know, exploding almost sometimes. And there was this almost constant, you know, daily process, and sometimes it'd be stronger, sometimes it'd be calmer. But there was always this very from the base going up to the top of the head. And I thought, well, how can this be happening? Because it's supposed to be working in the lower chakras and working its way up, through the lower chakras, through your heart chakra, through your third eye, into the Sarasara and up here. And I felt like, well, how am I getting this whole Zoom thing through the whole of my body? How come that's feeling that way to me? This doesn't make sense. And I was reading these books of symptoms, marrying up that to my experience, and I couldn't quite make it fit. But the thing that seemed to fit was this Vajra rising. So there's the Sushumna Nadi is the central nadi, where Kundalini ideally is going up through that nadi and working its way through your chakras slowly or quickly. And there's a few different ways of doing it, but fundamentally, there's different parts of the Sushumna, but fundamentally, ideally, it's in the Sushumna and going up. But it can have this deflected rising up the Vajra nadi, and the Vajra nadi has no blockages in it. It goes from the base and goes up into the Sarasara. The problem is that it can't rise beyond there. And so it's frustrated. It goes up and down and up and down, and it can do that for a long time. So you feel like you're on the top of the mountain, and then you feel like you've lost it all and you're at the bottom of the mountain. And you feel like at the top, and then you feel like you're at the bottom. So it's very kind of frustrating, because you go through these constant periods of sort of feeling enlightened and then feeling like you've lost it. And famously, Gopi Krishna, experienced that for a decade or so and had a very, very difficult time. And then eventually it was corrected. And I thought, well, that must be happening to me, because I'm getting this zooming up, and, it seems like it's going up and down, or it's going up and it's not going any further. And I did contact Sylvia at the Patanjali Kundalini Yoga Care, and did that, wrote my whole life history, to get a kind of diagnosis of where you are. And I had a call with her, and she said, yeah, you're having a Vajra, a deflected rising, which was a bit disconcerting. I thought, well, this is like a wrong rising, it's called deflective. It's not in the correct manner. So I was, naturally thinking, this is, and from her point of view was, yeah, well, that can happen if you don't go through the right, process to prepare yourself for Kundalini awakening. You may well have one of these deflective risings because your Sushumna's not open, it's not ready for it. You haven't been with a guru who's readied you for this process. And I thought, well, that was me. It was spontaneous. I didn't have any preparation. So I took that to be true. But then as time went on, I stumbled upon this top-down awakening. And so classically, the bottom-up awakening, like the true or the classic bottom-up awakening, is where, the coiled snake wakes up and pushes through the first granthi, the first knot, and then starts to work its way up the Sushumna, cleansing your chakras. But the other Kundalini awakening, which isn't that, is a top-down, which is also known as a sort of descent of grace, or when people, experience the Holy Spirit. I think I was listening to you on another podcast, Samir and Alan, talking about the sort of Indian and Egyptian models. And I think this is, the top down versus the bottom up is kind of that. And when I stumbled upon that, and I did speak to a Kundalini consultant, who I really rate, actually, a woman in India, who's got a brilliant YouTube channel, incredibly knowledgeable. And I spoke to her, and she said, oh, I think you're having a top-down awakening. And I was like, what's that? And she explained and said, watch these videos. And then that suddenly made perfect sense, which for me was this heart opening, right? From day one, I didn't experience it in my base chakra. I experienced it from my heart, is where it began. And so it's this, what they call descent of grace, whereby you are, given by grace, or you attract, and gurus can do it, or it happens spontaneously. That the Kundalini Shakti actually comes top down through your crown, apparently through a little opening at the front of your head here. And all of the cosmic energy, if you want to call it that, is brought into your body. And it comes in through channels and goes to the base, and it builds up in the base, and then it pushes up into your Sarasara, opening, your sort of 1,000 petals in your Sarasara. But it doesn't go up the Sushumna. It goes up your central column, but it's not specifically up the Sushumna. So it's a slightly technically different physiological, different subtle body thing that's happening. And apparently what that process is doing is cleansing all your chakras, but it doesn't do them one by one bottom up. It can go through your chakras and then go again and go again and go again. So it doesn't tend to be quite as violent, because when the snake is uncoiled, it goes through your chakras and it clears them out one by one. And as it clears them out, it's doing kind of the full-on job. This is what my understanding is. So that can be quite an experience if you've got a lot of trauma held in, one of your bottom three chakras. It's going to clear all of that out, and it's going to be quite a thing, and it could be a sort of dot out the soul experience. Whereas with the top down, it will clear something out and then do it again and do it again and do it again. So it's less focused and concentrated at any one moment in time. Is how it was explained to me. And the idea is you're creating this light body. And that's how it feels to me. I feel a huge amount of energy in my arms and my legs. And it feels like this electricity is alive in all of the limbs as well as the body. And that apparently is the process, is that you're building this light body as the process is cleansing your chakra and doing all this auric cleansing. But it isn't the marriage of Shakti and Shiva, which happens in the sort of classic process. But a top-down can lead to a bottom-up. And I think that's what's been happening with me, because, I spoke to this woman, and she said I spoke to her about my dreams, which were really enlightening, and because she talked a lot about if you're going to be here, you'll be having these dreams. She asked me a lot about my dreams, and my dreams were very much relating to Shakti trying to break through the first knot, which is the Brahman Granthi is the first knot in the base. And she said, when it happens, you won't miss it. And I didn't. It was quite painful. And I also saw it shatter in my mind, which is a strange thing, but I felt all this pain. I'd had these dreams about elephants trying to break through. I'd had dreams about trying to stab through the back of a crocodile with a knife. I'd had dreams about trying to drill through a wall. And this consultant said, she said, "Oh yeah, those dreams are the sign that Shakti's trying to break through this knot." And then I had this very physical pain experience. And then this seeing, it's very hard to describe the seeing because it was kind of visual, but it's sort of like a visual thought. It's hard to explain, but I saw this knot implode on itself like a crystal. It was like a crystal that completely imploded and disintegrated on itself. And since then, my symptoms have changed. Anyway, that's a lot about plumbing. But I was quite confused about my experience, and there is talk about top-down awakenings, but I sort of think it might be useful for the community to hear about it, because if people are interested in their symptoms and what they're experiencing, it's potentially useful to be aware of these different things.
Thanks a lot. That's fascinating and really interesting, and not something to maybe discuss in this conversation, but I want to add to what you just said, which is, I think what you're having is probably more normal than you think. This combination of top and bottom, and I wouldn't even. So I'm going to speak from my own opinion. I think I've been writing about how something new is happening, and I think you're giving a perfect description of what is happening that is new. It's a combination of different systems coming together, creating something new that's centered in the heart. It's emotional, it involves trauma, and the old models, which would involve like plumbing, as you say, and prana and Shakti and Shiva. I think, it's an old world view. There's something new happening. So I can relate very much to the combination of experiences that you've gone through. A combination of something that feels top down and bottom up, something that's very much heart opening, something that also very much your mother. I can really relate to your experience with your mother. Not with your mother, but with my own with my own mother. And very, very similar. And I think, and as a guy, although I was younger than you when I had an awakening, I was 30. So I'm now 48, so that's 18 years ago. But I was living in London, and I was living in that hedonistic London lifestyle that we lead, without a background in spiritual practice. So a lot of the things that you've discussed, I can really relate to. What I would say is, I wonder whether what you've just described is actually a fairly good summation of what a lot of people are going through. And it's not necessarily Kundalini in the old classic sense. It's something completely new. Because when it comes down to it, what we're going through is not necessarily a classic Kundalini experience. And this idea of top down, which I completely understand, I do think it comes from the Western system. No, we are experiencing two simultaneous, possibly more than two simultaneous systems of energy coming together in us, working and kind of balancing in the heart. I think that's the key, right? I think the heart is the center of all of these different systems. So a really nice kind of articulation of your experience. Before we talk about your psychotherapy experience, Alan, do you have anything you want to chip in with?
I want to comment on this because just to say, I think my opinion is that that there are all different kinds of ways of this happening, and actually, when we use the word Kundalini, it's a language that works pretty well. Obviously, comes from one particular tradition, but I think people all over the world have these experiences. And so, for instance, I've been reading a book about shamanism, and shamanic experiences, initiation experiences, sound incredibly similar. My personal experience was bottom up,
yeah.
But and it was actually, just backing up what you're saying, Nigel. Mine was so intense it just blew me off my feet. I think it's very interesting that even though you were in a way living in two worlds, with your normal working life and your internal life, the fact you were able to keep the working life going was very different from my experience. And I was out of the game for a while. But I think the key factor for all three of us, well, one weirdly is a mother issue, but that might be quite a common thing. But essentially the heart. I totally agree with both you and Samira said. I do feel, for me, the key is the heart, and it may sound a bit wishy-washy, but I do think that the love energy is a key component of this. But I want to go back and just ask a question about you over the last couple of years, how you have managed to navigate this with friends and family. Do you want to just say a bit about that, because it must have been quite a journey over the last 2 years how this has developed?
Yeah, and it's still I think that's still ongoing. My kids now know I'm spiritual. They they walk in and I'm meditating in the morning, and I will talk to them about um, say things like, well, maybe if you pray, it might happen, so, and they think they just sort of accept that, that's all fine. There was a time when, that just felt very strange that I would have to sort of come out of the closet and sort of say, well, I'm spiritual now, I've never been, but Daddy's now spiritual. With friends, I think, some more than others, but, there's just a lot of friends that I have who it's just a little bit of a waste of time talking to them about spiritual topics because they don't relate to it, and that's cool. They don't. I'm not going to talk. If I start talking about a load of stuff that they're not into, they're not into it. So I just don't need to bring that in. But I still feel like I'm partially in the closet, spiritually. Even at work, it's not something that I wear on my sleeve. You know what I mean? I don't sort of go around saying, "Oh yeah, it's my spiritual practice and what I do." I talk about meditating and things like that, but I tend to do it in the context of, being mental health, and so yeah, and it's. I think in my mind for quite a long time, this was just all built up. Do you know what I mean? It felt like I needed to come out and tell everybody, and I feel now that it's in a pretty good place. Yeah, I would say my marriage, that was a big question that came up, was how do I talk to my wife about that? And that felt like a challenge. And that's been a journey with the two of us as well. Probably not the time for me to talk about that in great detail, but maybe one for another day. But turns out, my wife is not in an entirely different place to what I am at the moment, which I would never have predicted. So that's been quite a journey and a story between us, and how we've navigated this together. Both, yeah, that's been quite a thing. But threw up a lot of challenges, particularly initially when I was off in, I was kind of in my own world. I was wrapped up in, as I said, this inner world that was kind of raging. Felt ill-equipped to really articulate it and talk to people around me. I just didn't know how to begin talking about it. And naturally, people like your wife, they might not know what you're thinking, but they know you're thinking something. So, what's going on with you? Why, what is going on with you? Is the question. What is going on with you? It's like, So there was a lot of that to navigate that did throw up quite a lot of challenges. But I'm pleased to say we managed to work through all of those things and worked through some of those, worked through those challenges, and it's in a good place now. Yeah, it's in a good place now. But there was a few scary moments where, yeah. But, everyone goes through that kind of thing anyway, don't they? But, and I would say, it's interesting when people say, this is going to turn your life on its head. For me, it's completely turned my life on its head. Like completely. It's just my whole outlook is entirely different. I feel like a completely different person. What I want, what I'm aiming for, what I'm looking forward to. I mean, the change in psychology is just unbelievable. It's incredible, and in a positive way. In my experience, I've just let go of so many fears. For me, it's been a massive letting go of fear. And when you let go of the fear, you sort of embrace more love, and so it's been a very, very, very positive experience with challenges along the way. I wouldn't change it for the world. No way. You could give me a suitcase with $1 billion in it, and I would give it you back if it meant exchanging. any of this. I wouldn't change it. So yeah, it's different for different people, but I kind of strangely think the world needs to wake up in this kind of householder environment, right? So I want to wake up without changing my whole life. I want to wake up in life. There's been times when we all want to run away to the Himalayas and hide in a cave and meditate all day. Of course, we can bliss out all day if we just sat on top of the mountain. But I know that's not what I want, and I know that's not my purpose. And I think waking up in a city like London, I still got my corporate job. I'm still doing it. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. And we kind of want an increase of, you guys have talked about this really articulately on other podcasts about, the general increase in consciousness and waking up and more people having these experiences. And if we want society to thrive and we want the world to thrive, we all want to wake up and keep the day job, don't we? That we can't give up on on life. We need schools and jobs and stuff, food to eat, and we need all of these things, and we might not need it in the way we need it today. We might need a whole new bunch of different values, and that's the point, though, isn't it? But yeah, it's not going to work if everyone needs to go and live in a cave for 10 years. So yeah, so I sort of see that as, in a way, my purpose, is to sort of wake up in a normal life, if that makes sense. Which, lots of people are doing, right? It's not unusual.
It makes a lot of sense. An old friend of mine went to see Eckhart Tolle at the Albert Hall recently, and I was just looking at my phone to see what her quote was. But he said something on the lines that when you take away one thing, it's not what I remember is more banana rama. It ain't what you do; it's the way that you do it. He said something. He said something on those lines, but it does make some sense, doesn't it? And that it's always good to take such wise words from a pop song. But I think we all have this. Many people I've talked to have this sense of embodiment and actually doing this within the world, not somehow esoterically outside it.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm going to just jump in and give a quote that Anna Greer, who we interviewed a few months ago, sent me an email recently, and she wrote this. She said, she believes in the central role of a deeply embodied spirituality that is profoundly grounded in real human life, rather than trippy escapist disembodying. And then she talks about the need to embrace the materiality of self-realization. And I think that's kind of what you're doing. And I think that's kind of what we believe in the Kundalini Collective, which is there is this kind of other way of looking at stuff where enlightenment is some kind of othering and a kind of non-material space, which is away from real life. And I think the more we go through this process, the more we begin to realize that there's something that we need to do to bring down these experiences into the everyday life, into the body, into real life, and into the real world. Because otherwise, what's the point? You don't get change from running away from your world. So I think, like you, Nigel, I mean, I stayed in London and you stayed in London. Like a lot of people, I'm not saying it's wrong to leave London at all, but I think there is something to be said about actually just staying put, working with what you have, and learning to kind of appreciate the space that you're in, even though it can be quite difficult. And it seems like your journey really, really well kind of articulates this experience. So I want to ask you about psychotherapy, because this is the other side of the conversation. You have had a journey with psychotherapy, which you said started with your journey with Kundalini, and you've given a presentation which I really enjoyed a few months ago to the Kundalini Collective about psychology, psychotherapy, and Kundalini. And I know you may touch upon that presentation when you go into this, but I think it's worth it because not everybody's going to be able to see that presentation. So just from your own experiences, from your own journey, where do you see the links between Western psychology and spirituality?
Yeah, well, yeah, and totally integrated is how I like to see it. And I guess the context as well is, I had this awakening that I described. Just after that, I did a course in counselling, just a short one, 10-week, evening course because I was interested in psychology. And whilst everyone was talking about psychological models and, therapy and counseling and Freud and, cognitive behavioral therapy, I was going through this whole awakening experience and thinking, you're all missing something massive here. So we're talking about psychology, but what I'm experiencing seems to be trumping it. It's like if you can experience this, all your problems melt away, which was slightly false as well. But at that moment in time, I was thinking, yeah, psychology is interesting, but there's something much bigger. It's like something much bigger that you're not talking about. You're talking about how to be happy. So I was a bit sort of frustrated about that. Anyway, I wanted to carry on and do a year-long course, and I looked at some places, and I stumbled upon CCPE, which is a transpersonal psychotherapy school, the Centre for Counselling and Psychotherapy Education, which is in Paddington in London. And I went for an interview there, and I didn't know anything about the school. And they said, they interview and they say, "What's going on with you?" And I said, "Well, I'm going through this quite big spiritual thing right now." And they said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Well, we really integrate spiritual thinking and Western psychological thinking, within the school." So I nearly fell off my chair and sort of went, "Great, this is where I need to be." So at the beginning of 2023, I started my foundation year in transpersonal psychotherapy, which was a huge blessing for me as well, because again, in this world where I was trying to integrate it, when I was at CCPE, you're surrounded by people who are totally open to spirituality and talking about spirituality alongside psychology. So it was really, really, really useful for me. And I actually went through the spiritual bypassing process myself. So at the school there, they don't believe in spiritual bypassing. We can talk about what that is. And I went through periods of thinking, never mind this psychology stuff. I'm sitting at the top of the mountain and everything's great. All my trauma's been solved, and I'm in a state of bliss and everything's happy. I don't need to worry about my childhood and my relationship with my dad or my mum or what happened, in my marriage or anything else. Everything's good now. It's all sorted. But of course, that's a very temporary situation, and you find yourself coming back down to earth. And then having to deal with those situations that, those psychological things that do exist. So just to say, the transpersonal psychology really, well, I would say Carl Jung was the first transpersonal psychologist, because he was, one of the first psychologists, Western psychologists, who absolutely embraced spirituality. And he did at a time. He had to be quite careful, because if he went too far out there, he would have been rejected as someone who was just talking about mystical stuff. And that's one of the reasons he split from Freud, was Freud wanted to be taken seriously in like a clinical, world where the psychological work was important clinical work that needed to be taken seriously, that needed to be researched, that needed to have proper theories. And Jung actually wanted to embrace the mystical. And Freud didn't want to, so that was one of the reasons that they kind of had this split. But absolutely, Jung was probably the first one, and then probably in the 60s, it gathered more pace with people like Stanislav Grof looking at psychedelics and sort of saying what's going on there. People like Ken Wilber bringing in Buddhist Eastern thinking and marrying that up with Western psychology. So there's a lot of people sort of in the 60s and 70s who are going to universities and being professors in psychology, but also experience spirituality and wanting to bring them together. And so they started to create these models of saying, well, yes, we've got this psychology thing, which makes sense, but there's something much bigger than that, which is beyond the individual. So we're not just individuals, we're individuals plus something much bigger. So what does that mean for our psyche? What does it mean for our happiness? What does that mean for our psychological processes? And how can we start to try and understand these sorts of things and bring them together? So I think transpersonal psychology does just that. And in essence, I think they fit well, they fit perfectly together, because Western psychology is great at sorting out our egos. Western psychology is good at creating a well-formed ego. Understand your life, understand your trauma, understand all the challenges of things that you've had, difficult childhoods. A classic, we've all talked about things with our mothers. They affect you, and they affect you subconsciously, really, really big, whether you know it or not. And Western psychology is very good at looking at that and saying, well, what is going on, and can we understand it and bring it into the light, and ultimately make peace with it and find acceptance with it. And that's about creating a rounded ego. And spirituality is all about transcending that ego. But I fundamentally believe you will not transcend your ego until you have got it into good shape. And you can do that the hard way or the easy way. And that if you're in a Kundalini process, the hard way is let Kundalini just ravage through you, and you will face all of your dark nights, right? You will come face to face with all these problems sooner or later, because all of these traumas are stored in one chakra or the other. And, it will take you there. And I think, well, why not get ahead of it? Why not use some Western psychology, shadow work, trauma work, therapy and counseling? Let's look at our childhoods. Let's try and understand where we've come from and what's created our psyches, and bring that into the light. Bring it into the light in a sort of controlled manner. So rather than it just happening, like crazily, go and look for it. Go and ask yourself to heal what is in your shadow and find out what's in your shadow. And actually, most good spiritual teachers, I think, say do the shadow work, right? They say do the shadow work, do that, get your ego sorted out. So I think Ken Wilber said words to the effect of, you need to form an ego before you can transcend it. And I think, we've seen it in our community. You see some people, with the greatest compassion, you see some people who are in very shaky places. Their egos are kind of all over the place. They're not grounded. They haven't got their arms around really who they are. They haven't understood who they are, where they've come from. There's all sorts of anxiety and things bouncing around inside of them. And that makes Kundalini a really, really difficult process, I think. So I'm all for bringing them together, and that's certainly been my experience. Last year I went, I did a lot of re-experience my childhood trauma. It was a very difficult couple of months. But when I'd worked through it and came out of it, I kind of felt this spiritual lift. I'd faced into these fears. I'd done it with a therapist in a kind of controlled environment. I'd gone into it, sort of purposefully. It's like I'm doing this because I'm trying to work myself out. I'm trying to understand myself. So you're kind of inviting it, basically, and opening yourself up. And I think doing that with skill and care, of a psychotherapist or counselor who's a professional and knows what they're doing, they're holding that space for you. They're being a safe container for you, to let all of this stuff come out and come into the light. And having someone hold that container with you and for you is a very, very valuable thing to do. And I think it's a lot easier than doing it on your own. Where you're fumbling around in the dark and it's just happening to you. So yeah, I think there's a very, very strong case of bringing them together. And I think there is a lot of spiritual bypassing. And I think the challenge, I think, with some of the spiritual teaching is you get very elevated spiritual teachers who are at a high level telling you about absolute reality. And they're right. Absolute reality is absolute reality. And if, you know, they're at a very high level, they're experiencing this very, very high level of spiritual knowledge. And they're guiding you, but their way of guiding you is to say, well, this is what the view looks like from up here. But if you're not up there, the view to you isn't absolute reality. The view to you is relative reality. And relative reality is if a car hits you, it hurts. You know, if your girlfriend leaves you, it hurts. If your children are upset with you, it hurts. You know, we need positive relationships. We need strong relationships. We need a positive emotional experience, which is all to do with relative reality, which is the reality in which I am living. And one day I might transcend it. I haven't transcended it yet, so I need to work with what I've got. And I think that's the challenge, I think, with some of the spiritual teachers is they're doing it from a very elevated point, rather than necessarily saying, oh, well, you know, Alan, Samir, Nigel, I can see where you're at. You know, Alan, you're here. Samir, you're here. Nigel, you're here. What you need to do is this, and what you need to do is this, and what, you know, it's more like a very tailored approach. So I think there is a danger of spirituality, and I've experienced it in my spiritual teaching. You know, it's all an illusion. It's just your story. It didn't really happen. They're just emotions. They're just feelings. They're not real. And I think that's really poor advice to someone who's going through a really difficult emotional time, to tell them that it doesn't really matter because none of it's real. That isn't helpful to that person in that moment in time. They need to be held, their story needs to be told, and they need to work through that. It doesn't work going around it. You know, for me, we work through it, not around it. And that's I think the benefit of being a little bit more humble and being a little bit more real about where you're actually at, rather than this. I've seen and you know, I've been there because I've been there. Oh, I'm sitting at the top of the mountain and everything's fine. Well, that wasn't true. You know, in the middle of my 2 months of really emotional hard work, I suddenly was right back down to earth, you know, facing into childhood trauma, which felt very, very real.
Thank you, Nigel. That makes a lot of sense. Just a lot of sense. We know we have to process. We have to process stuff before we can let it go. I've got a question. This is something I've not really thought about much myself, really, but I've heard it said a number of times, and I think it is an interesting topic. Have you thought of this in relation to, you know, you talk about your own trauma or your own issues that we all need to work through. Do you think there's also an area where there's family issues or collective issues that when we're going through this sort of process, we may need to process as well, if that makes sense?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And again, this is the you know, this is the skillful thing that's really hard, I think, for all of us to understand, because we're talking about being an individual, and then the next minute we're saying, well, I know I'm not an individual because I'm connected to everything. And was that my dream, or was that a dream from the collective consciousness? So, you know, do I own the content of that dream, or is that somehow not mine and it's everybody's? And all these sorts of questions. So yeah, for sure, but I think start with, you know, I can only talk about my own experience and being a sort of amateur at the beginning, you know, sort of at the beginning, which is, you know, I'm sort of dealing with my, you know, my past lifetime traumas come up in my therapy. So that's been a big thing, actually. So it's not just this lifetime in my experience, it's my past lifetime as well. But I think you start with where you're at and who you are, and, you know, you sort of start there, don't you? But there's certainly a lot of intergenerational trauma. And it's good to see that, I think, because I know there's a lot of intergenerational healing that people go to and get into, and I think that's a really, really valuable thing to do. And I think that's really important, to recognize that your trauma has been brought down through your family's DNA. And you can see, in Vedanta, they'd say karma is universal, right? We're all dealing with universal karma. It's not just Nigel dealing with Nigel's karma. Nigel's dealing with all the karma, and everyone's dealing with all the karma. So, but that goes into sort of what we experience, right? So if you're in a war and you are traumatized, well, you may say, well, that wasn't brought upon me by me. That was, that's universal trauma happening, traumatizing the population, which then needs to be healed in this generation or the next generation or the generation after that. So yeah, I think it's really important to broaden the perspective. But I think if you start somewhere, start with how you feel and your relationships and what's happened with you. But yeah, one of the great things about the transpersonal sort of psychotherapy approach is really bringing in a lot of imagination, visualization, dream therapy, dream work, lots of ways to access. You can call it subconscious, or you can call it, your soul, and those sorts of, what's in your soul. I like to see, the way I see the world is that we are having multiple lifetimes, and in each lifetime we collect karma and we heal karma. And I think part of the Kundalini process is we're trying to burn that karma down to zero at some point in whatever lifetime, where you're stopping collecting it and you're starting to heal it. And you start to heal past lifetime karma and stuff like, stuff like that. And you start to let go of your fears and you stop creating new problems, and you're really solving the ones that you've got. And it's that, your soul comes into a lifetime with something, with a purpose, with a life to lead, and with lessons to learn. I think it's really great questions. Just ask yourself, what are the lessons that I think I should be learning in this lifetime? What are the relationships that I'm having, and what are the lessons that I think should be learning? Because for me, I want to learn them in this lifetime if I can. If we can all do that, the world will be a better place. So yeah, and I think, I experienced a lot of death in my past life, which I carried into I carried into my childhood, and I can see the helplessness and the loneliness and the death that showed up for me in early life and was kind of part of who I am. So trying to process that is a really useful thing to do. And the only way to get into that is through you won't get into that just by talking to a therapist. I think that's what's really good about a transpersonal approach is we can talk all day about our relationships with our mothers, chatting about, yeah, my mum was like this and I did that and she didn't like me and I responded like this. And that's all good. That's very different to re-experiencing the trauma emotionally. And if you really want to heal the wound, you need to really re-experience that trauma. You need to go back to that place, really feel how you felt at that time, bring that into the light and heal that wound. And to go into that emotionally requires a very skillful therapist. And sometimes it requires some different techniques to just move your ego out of the way, because our egos are masterful at telling us we're okay and just making sense of everything. Yeah, I'm all right. I'll be okay. It wasn't great, but I'm okay. And actually, that's just continuing to suppress things. It's not really opening up. And the more open you can be, the more it will come into the light and the better it will be healed. So yeah, using imagination is a great way just to move your ego out of the way a little bit, and open yourself up. And that's all the stuff that we're being taught on the transpersonal psychotherapy course. So, creative imagination is a really good way to access your deeper emotions. Yeah. Otherwise, you can just talk a long time. You can talk a lot and not quite get to where you need to get to.
Thanks, Nigel. Yes, you can see a hurdle, but not necessarily jump it. That
Yeah, you kind of go, you know, I did it for a year and a half around, you know, some abuse and stuff. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't define me. Yeah, I know that happened. Yeah, I know. I'm not hiding from it. I know it happened. It doesn't define who I am. That's not really going there. You know, that's just sort of, that's really keeping it to one side. So you're not denying it, but you're not really opening yourself up to it. And when I did, I realized that I was so ashamed. You know, I felt so much shame around this experience that I didn't want to see myself like that. I just did not want to see myself as someone who was ashamed. I'd created an ego where I was a person who wasn't ashamed of anything. Why should I be ashamed of anything? But I was feeling a lot of shame. And when I brought it into the light, it was very, very painful. It was overwhelming to suddenly face that shame. It was very, very hard to hold. But I knew I had to, and I wanted to, and I wanted to do it. And my heart has felt so much more open since that process. You know, it feels like I've pulled out this big thorn of shame. And in pulling out that thorn, it's just made more space, you know, for the good feelings, you know, ultimately, I have more love for myself because I'm not feeling this shame. So yeah, it's a really interesting process, but net, I think Kundalini just, you know, whatever process of Kundalini you're going from, it is opening us up. It is trying to purify and cleanse us in whatever process it is. And I would say, if you can work with that and embrace that as a process, you know, embrace it and work with it rather than just it be more ad hoc and more haphazard. And it comes to you when it comes to you. So try and get ahead of it, I suppose, is you know, go and look for it rather than just wait for it to surprise you, and look for it with the right support and the right help and the right emotional container. Yeah. Yeah, and don't get caught in spiritual bypassing if you can help it, because I think it's just an honesty of where you are on the path. You know, it's like, I'm not an ascended master. I'm an amateur. I'm a beginner. So, you know, and the problem is with Kundalini, you can have moments when you feel like you're an ascended. You know, I've had these feelings where I've gone, oh my word, I'm on the top of the mountain. I have no problems in life. I feel so amazing. Everything's solved. Great, you know. But if that isn't sustained, if it is sustained, congratulations, you know, you've made it. But if that isn't sustained, then you're not there. And be honest with yourself, you're not there. And as much as you might want to be there, you're not there. And be real, you know, you are living in relative reality, not absolute reality. So we've got that to deal with, and we've got real life to deal with. Yeah.
Nigel, it's really interesting hearing your story, and we haven't interrupted very much because it is really powerful and from the heart. So I want to kind of draw this to a close, but just ask, do you feel post Kundalini, how do you feel as a father and as a husband and as a man? Do you feel like the journey has been difficult, but it's changed you for the better?
Well, I sort of act, yeah, father and a husband, and well, it's sort of, I think I accept that I've just, like everyone, tried my best, and you know, no question, I've screwed up my kids to some extent, because it feels like everyone gets screwed up to some extent. but I'm very sort of accepting of the imperfection of everything. You know, it's life is so imperfect, and I think that's part of the journey is to seeing, you know, the perfection in the imperfection, isn't it? And it's kind of we're all trying to do the best we can, and we've all made a million mistakes, and we'll all continue to make errors and make mistakes, but it is all to be forgiven, isn't it? And I think you've got to have a massive dollop of self-compassion, and not to, you know, and that's not to shy away from your responsibilities and like spiritually bypass your responsibilities, but yeah, I don't know. I certainly feel, yeah, there's just a whole different perspective on life, isn't it? I think we're just trying to do something entirely different now. What I was trying to do pre-awakening was, I think I was trying to be happy by controlling my circumstances in life. You know, if I had the right job and the right house and a car and the holidays, and if my wife would be like this, and you know, and do exercise, and you know, I've got good friendships. It's like you're sort of trying to create this life of circumstances which create this happiness. And of course, the more you do, the more there is to do. And it's okay, it's not bad, but it's very, very different to now, where all those values are just completely changed. It's hard to explain, isn't it? But the psychology just completely flips, and you suddenly realize that the circumstances had nothing to do with what you need or what you want. The circumstances are the circumstances, and it is all within. And suddenly, you know, that for me is the awakening. Is this massive realization that it's, you know, your whole life experience is generated by you. Everything you see is you. You know, it's that. It's not everything you see is you. Just understand that, you know, and I'm sort of waking up to that. And the more that penny drops and the more that is embraced, the fears drop away as well, I think. You know, it's that the things that you used to be frightened of, you stop to be frightened of, and they show up in very small ways, I think. Like fear of being late for a meeting. Like, oh, I can't be late for a meeting. Oh, I can't be late. I can't be. So, you know, why can't you be late? Well, if I'm late, they'll think I don't care. Will they? Do you know that? And if they do, does it matter? Well, no, actually. So, you know, why are we worried about being late for a meeting? And I think what my life before was chronically full of all these little fears. You know, some big fears like, oh my God, I might get divorced, or, you know, I might lose my job, you know, big real fears, but lots of chronic little fears. Worried about what you're going to wear. You're worried about what's going to happen when you turn up at the dinner party. All sorts of, what will they think? You know, it's really mind-boggling to think about how chronic fear is in people's lives. And I think when you start to get, somehow you start to get control of, you start to see your thoughts. You start to see your thoughts as thoughts, and it's optional whether you hold on to them or let them go, right? And I think when that kind of happens, your life changes, because you go, okay, I don't need to think that, and yeah, I don't need to respond like that, and you know, I may have responded like that, but I'm just going to let that go, because I don't want to respond like that. And that's the big change, I think, for me, is just that change in psychology, which, yeah, I think that's just part of the process, and part of, you know, is that because we meditate every day? Would that happened if we hadn't meditated every day? Is that because I've done psychotherapy or not? You know, who knows? Who knows? Sorry, I feel like I'm going off on a tangent there.
Oh, it's great. Alan, do you have anything you want to share?
And I don't think so. I think, thank you, Nigel. I think it's been I've really found it a very interesting story, and the issues you've brought up being, you know, very poignant, and I can definitely identify with them. So thank you so much for being brave enough to talk about your experience, and yeah. So thank you.
It's been a great conversation, and it's actually really, really real. I mean, it reminds me, I've been thinking that actually, I think you wrote in your notes, can there be any spiritual bypassing with Kundalini? I don't think there can be, but I think there's something that we really have to bring it down to the real world, and to bring it down to real world, one of the models that's going to help is psychotherapy rather than an old Indic Vedic model. And I think that people can relate to that more. And in a way, what I've begun to realize, and I think you've been saying this just by telling me your story, that Kundalini Awakening makes you more real. It doesn't take you away from life. It brings you right into life. And I wasn't living, let's say, a full life where I embraced all my flaws and everything and all the pain. And actually, life is about learning to love the pain and the suffering and the blissful moments. It's about both. It's not about just the bliss. And I think that's what Kundalini really does. It brings us back into the world and makes us real people in a way that I couldn't have done beforehand. So I kind of completely, agree with you, and I love your story. I think it's great. And I hope you come back on podcast, in a year or so we can see what you've been doing. I'm sure there's a great journey ahead of you.
Well, yeah, thank you. No, it's been a privilege to talk about myself, I suppose, and it's been very cathartic. Feels like part of my process of integrating and talking and making this part of my life rather than something that's bouncing around in my head. So it's a real honor to, I hope it's of interest in some way. Yeah,
it will be. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Nigel. We'll hopefully see you soon. And take care.
Yeah. Thanks, Nigel.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Samir.